So our aim in this sort of 1 hour session, which we begin with now, is really to look at these two major themes in development finance, making it effective or reducing ineffectiveness in different ways. That is the anti-corruption agenda and the rule of law agenda. And of course, both of those have other drivers and bigger constellations of commitments and actors than just the core of the development finance field. So in a way, there's a sprawl into development finance or the other way round. So we've put these two together because they both have those properties, but not because we're trying to draw any deeply thought out or subtle connections or contrasts between them, although some of that might emerge. So what we have here starts at least as a connected juxtaposition. So first, Kevin Davis is going to talk about anti-corruption and development banking, and then Michael Woolcock is going to talk about issues to do with rule of law promotion, and Jean Touchette is going to comment on both of those in the way he sees fit, and then we'll have a bit of general discussion. And this part of the session ends at 3 when we will then turn to the sovereign debt, sovereign borrowing question. So we start with Kevin Davis.
Thanks, Benedict. So this paper is all about the World Bank's sanctions process, which is the process for debarring firms that are found to have engaged in either fraudulent or corrupt practices, but I'll be focusing on the corrupt practices for the purposes of the presentation. There actually is a paper. I'm embarrassed to say it was only delivered around midnight last night, so it's definitely hot off the presses, but it is actually related to things I've been thinking about for quite some time. So first of all, it's about innovation, and it's about, in particular, the evaluation of innovations. I'm very interested in that aspect of the overall theme of this conference. How do we know whether an innovation is actually a success? So the paper is an attempt to get some traction on that question. I also wrote the paper because I'm interested in this particular innovation. I've been doing a fair amount of work recently on regulation of foreign corrupt practices or regulation of corrupt practices on a global scale, and the World Bank is playing a significant role in that. And so I wanted to think about just the role of the World Bank in the regulation of transnational corruption in its own right. So that's where the motivation for the paper comes from. Let me say a bit about what the innovation actually is, or the series of innovations. The World Bank can debar firms that have engaged in fraudulent or corrupt practices. Corrupt practices are basically defined to include bribery, and that can consist of bribery in any aspect of a bank finance project, basically. There have been some very high-profile debarments. Probably the most notable one is Siemens, which was prosecuted by the US Department of Justice. The Munich prosecutor also was held liable by the SEC. In addition to all those sanctions, the $1.6 billion worth of sanctions it paid to that group of actors, it also had one of its subsidiaries debarred by the World Bank, and it agreed to pay $100 million into a fund administered by more or less by the World Bank to support anti-corruption activities. So that was one of the probably the largest sanctions imposed by the World Bank as sort of part of this debarment and sanctions process. More recently, Alstom has been debarred for 3 years, and it had to pay $9.5 million. Oxford University Press, one of its subs, was debarred and had to pay $500,000 in penalties. So that's the kind of sanction that the World Bank likes to point to when it talks about how this process is working. There aren't that many of these still. There were 62 debarments last year, but that's 62 separate entities that were debarred. Only 18 of them dealt with corrupt practices. And that's really only 4 separate cases, because quite often individuals and affiliates are debarred separately. The way the process works is it starts with an investigation by INT, the World Bank's Integrity Vice Presidency. So they're sort of the police and the investigators. They also serve as the prosecutors. They bring whatever information they find forward to a person called the Evaluation and Suspensions Officer, who makes an initial determination of whether there's merit to the allegations, and if they're not contested, the evaluations officer can impose or recommend sanctions, which are then imposed. Alternatively, if the respondent wants to contest the allegations, then there's a second tier of review by something called the Sanctions Board, which is a 7-member body, majority of whose members are external to the bank. And it's like a court. This is a quasi-judicial proceeding. There's submissions of evidence, there's hearings, there are rules of evidence, there's a reasoned decision that's issued, the decisions are now being published. So it's, the World Bank has basically set up its own mini legal system, right, with investigation, prosecution, and adjudication, and ultimately sanctioning. There are 2 ways to avoid the hearing part of that process and to short-circuit the process overall. One is by entering into some sort of voluntary disclosure, where you participate in their voluntary disclosure program, which allows firms that are not yet subject to a formal investigation to avoid any formal public sanctions by agreeing to disclose everything, conduct an internal investigation, and agree to a compliance program. The other way to short-circuit things, which you can do at any stage in the process, is to enter into a settlement agreement with the bank, which is what Alstom and Siemens did. So that's the process, which I think of as being kind of innovative, right? So the claims in the paper are, first of all, that this is an innovation, which I think is reasonably clear, because it's something that could easily be replicated by the other development banks, and it's something that could be extended beyond, say, fraudulent and corrupt practices to other kinds of misconduct. So I think it fits the definition of an innovation. And it's what I want to call a regulatory innovation, because here the bank, what it's doing is it's actually trying to regulate the conduct of private firms around the world. A fairly large swath of firms, certainly that are engaged in infrastructure projects, are now or ought to be concerned about the World Bank sanctions. So it seems to me that the innovation here is this attempt to regulate not just borrower countries the way we're familiar with the bank trying to do, but actual private actors, and in a very legalistic way or legalized fashion. Okay, so that's the first claim. In the paper, I don't talk about the reasons why the World Bank is doing this, but we could say that this is probably a way of them trying to remain relevant in a world where their influence is diminishing. It's a way of extending their influence and leveraging the small amounts of capital, relatively small amounts of capital they're providing to countries to influence a fairly broad range of activity. Okay, so that's the first claim. The second claim is that this kind of innovation in the world of development finance is inherently difficult to evaluate. In 2 ways. First, it's difficult to figure out even what criteria we ought to use to evaluate it. And secondly, even if we know what the criteria are, it's difficult to figure out how to apply them, whether they've been breached, any standards derived from those criteria have been breached. So it's hard to trace causal connections between what the World Bank is doing with its sanctions process and any outcomes that we might care about. Right? And this, I think, is a real problem. How do we go about evaluating this particular kind of innovative activity? So let me elaborate on those 2 claims. First of all, about the problem of identifying the appropriate criteria. Right? In the evaluations that I've found of the sanctions process, the focus has really been on whether it is compatible with what I call lawyers' values. Right? These evaluations have been written by some lawyers, some very high-profile lawyers, like Dick Thornburg, the former Attorney General of the US. He did an evaluation, and then internal bank lawyers as well have written articles or reports about the sanctions process. And their focus is really on all the things that you'd expect lawyers to focus on. Is it effective in terms of deterring corruption? Is it efficient, basically looking at the cost of the whole process? Then does it comport with norms of due process or the rule of law or global administrative law? Take your pick. Those sorts of concerns about fairness. So is it transparent? Is there sufficiently independent adjudication? Is there reason giving, rationality, etc.? Right? So let's just take this perspective for a moment and think about whether this is a workable mode of evaluation. I think the problem is that there's some inherent tensions between even those criteria, right? So take the cost versus fairness. The formality of these proceedings, right, makes them much fairer. You've got the right to a hearing, you've got a right to have a lawyer there, and so you can bring in, Clary Gottlieb or whoever you like to represent you in these proceedings. But this racks up the cost. This adds to those administrative costs that Devesh was concerned about, right? Running an entire legal system on top of your banking operations actually does tend to add to the transaction costs and to delay things. So, so that there is that tension between cost on the one hand and efficiency on the one hand and fairness on the other hand. There's also, interestingly, some tension even within these principles, like transparency and independence can conflict sometimes with concerns about cost and effectiveness. Take the voluntary disclosure program. This is supposed to be an effective way of inducing firms to disclose misconduct and to rat out their peers in a given industry, right? It also avoids the cost of a hearing. But at the same time, the sanctions that are imposed, essentially, when you have to agree to a compliance program, aren't very transparent. So the terms of the compliance program that you have to agree to are difficult for outsiders to monitor, and they're not reviewed directly by an independent body like the Sanctions Board. Right? So there's another compromise that's being struck there. And you could say the same thing about the settlement process. It's cost-effective on the one hand, but limited independent review of the terms of the settlements, and they're not very transparent. Okay. For the people in the room who are not lawyers and who are coming from more of a development background, you might think, well, this isn't what we should be focusing on with this process. We should really be focusing on on the results, right? The kinds of results that development analysts usually focus on. What is this doing for the quality of governance, say, in the countries, in the host countries, in borrower countries? Or what is it ultimately doing for poverty reduction? And again, it's hard, right, to evaluate this kind of process in these terms. First of all, there could be a tension between having a full-blown fair process, which is also really expensive, and having funds left over to dedicate to development lending. So that's an obvious concern. But in addition, in the world of anti-corruption law, there's a real concern that if you start penalizing firms and firms that are less than completely honest and above board in their dealings, right? And if you start excluding them from bank finance projects and from working in the developing world, you're actually penalizing the most vulnerable members of global society, right? Because you're saying if those firms are uniquely qualified, even if those firms are uniquely qualified to carry out the work associated with the project, they still can't participate because of the corruption concern. There's this idea that that's actually contrary to an interest in promoting development. So there's a tension on the one hand between good governance, or a potential tension between good governance and development promotion. And so is a zero tolerance approach for corruption really the right way to go? That's another difficult value judgment. Which of those values, which of those criteria should we really be focusing on? And then, of course, finally, on this front, there's the issue of legitimacy. Right? Is the World Bank really in the best position to make these decisions, to exercise this sort of power? Is it a truly impartial regulator, right? Or an instrument of Western hegemony? That's basically the concern. Are the staff members of INT likely to be independent of the interests of, say, home countries of the multinationals that are paying these bribes, and independent of the governments of the host countries, the borrower countries, whose officials may not want to see the corruption investigated? So that's a case in favor of having the bank as the repository of this kind of power. But on the other hand, maybe they're just part of the same OECD consensus that is in favor of being tough on corruption on the one hand, unless it really prejudices one of their national champions. So that's the debate. And is the World Bank the right wielder of power? Less clear. Let me just spend 2 minutes on the last part of the paper, which is part that's premised on the idea that, well, let's say we know what the standards are. We've identified the criteria for evaluating the effectiveness of the sanctions process. Can we actually trace the results? Can we actually determine as a causal matter that the operation of the process is leading to particular kinds of outcomes? It's hard because the direct influence that the bank exercises in this fashion is limited. For all the reasons that Devesh and others have talked about, the role of the bank in transferring capital to the world, to the developing world, is declining. And so the amount of business that firms stand to lose by being debarred from bank finance projects is declining, right? So the threat value is diminishing. On the other hand, as Laurence pointed out, there are these indirect effects. There's the indirect power that the bank exercises through its ability to co-finance projects and, of course, to cross-debar, right, to trigger cross-debarment by the other multilateral development banks, and I can talk about how that works, and to refer their findings, the findings of their investigations, to national authorities. So there may be more sting in this process than first meets the eye. But it's going to be difficult. This means that any effects that the process is having are likely to be through these indirect effects and through these indirect channels and will be difficult to trace. On top of that, there are going to be confounding influences because this is a crowded space. You've got the US Department of Justice, the SEC, the Germans, the Brits. Everyone is trying to regulate corruption, not to mention the national authorities in the borrower countries, and identifying the separate influence of this process for the purpose of evaluating its effectiveness could be challenging. So that's what the paper is about, basically, trying to identify this as a new form of innovation, a regulatory innovation. And I think, to put it in a nutshell, this paper is all about the bank trying to become a global anti-corruption agency, right? And asking the question, is that a good thing? And my response is, well, it's hard to know. It's really hard to know for all the reasons that it would be hard to answer that question if it was posed straight up. Is it a good idea to establish any sort of global anti-corruption agency? That's obviously going to be a difficult question that involves difficult value judgments, difficult judgments about legitimacy, and difficult empirical judgments about the effects of the agency's operations. So with that, I'll close, and that's the paper.
Good. Many thanks, Kevin. Michael.
Thanks very much, Benedict, and thanks to NYU for inviting me here. And it's a good opportunity to talk about the work that I have currently going on, but it's I'm going to adjust it a little bit, just given how the conversation has evolved over to the day so far. If your physiology is like mine, you're about 25 minutes after lunch, so things are starting to wind down, and I'm going to have to be really good to keep you awake. But I'll do what I can to try and at least give you a flavor of how some of this stuff plays out in the World Bank, at least the part of it that I either occupy or have helped to create. I work in the research department of the World Bank. I have for the last 15 years. But over the last 10 years, I've been at the center of trying to launch a whole program around law and justice called Justice for the Poor. And if you may have heard of that program, if you haven't, just type those words into Google and it'll bring up our whole work program of the last 10 years. But it was brought about in response to what turned out to be a binding constraint kind of problem in many of the countries in which we were working. Initially in Indonesia, which is where this program started, but subsequently in Cambodia, Sierra Leone, and a bunch of other, about a dozen or so other countries around the world as well. And it's very much trying to engage with this question from the point of view of the user of justice system. So rather than saying, from sort of what are the World Bank's policies on the rule of law, or what formal guidelines does the bank have around all of this stuff, really just saying when you go into a country like the Solomon Islands, for example, and you see the local police constable's office with 800 files stacked up against the floor, And literally across the road from where he is working, there is a $250 million brand new courthouse that's just been built by the Australian government. And around the corner from that is a $150 million jail that's got 8 inmates in it, but is state of the art. You know, what world have we created when responding to this thing called the rule of law means that we build fancy courthouses and fancy jails because that's what we know how to do, when the actual problems faced by people are much more modest, usually. They want fair dealings with the government on healthcare and education. They want issues pertaining to land transactions dealt with. They want to be treated fairly when they want to present domestic violence cases or theft or other routine kinds of criminal offences, or particularly how do we deal with questions around land. Land is the big issue for which enormous amounts of contention and conflict is unfolding in the world. And so when the development world encounters these kinds of problems, the sort of the knee-jerk reaction is, well, the problem in these countries is that they don't have the rule of law. And of course, that sort of phrase has been bandied about for decades as a indeed, if you believe Brian Daminaha and other people that have been studying this for a long time, it's hard to name another issue in development that enjoys broader political left, right, and global north-south endorsement as something we should be caring about. But you can't also name another issue, I don't think, where there is a bigger gulf between that consensus and yet a track record of fairly ordinary non-accomplishment, to put it politely, regarding how we do that. Now, you know, if David was here, and David Trubeck and others that have been writing about this for 40 years, right? So, but there tends to be 2 dominant narratives that emerge when we're trying to explain this. One is sort of the problems pertaining to legal transplants, sort of cut and paste legal reform, and the fact that we try and take one template of legal reasoning or one legal code from one particular country and introduce it into another. Or if we don't do that, then we, at least over the last 10 or 15 years or so, have started to use notions around legal empowerment. So we should be trying to engage more directly with villagers themselves and trying to help them to be more assertive and effective claimants, political actors pertaining to their rights and exercising their obligations of citizenship. So the paper that we prepared and that I'm notionally presenting here in the 12 minutes that I've got left is really sort of trying to say, well, there's a missing middle in all. There's 3 different ways in which both of those discourses can be simultaneously correct and yet not deal with what our 10 years of engagement with these issues suggests is some pretty serious issues that are missing. I mean, I think the broader task that we face in all of this, I think, is that we're trying ultimately to raise the credibility, the capability, and the accessibility of legal institutions in contexts of intensifying legal pluralism. And last year I happened to do a book on this with Brian Daminaha on legal pluralism, which came out of our attempts to try and forge a more constructive dialogue between the worlds of scholarship around legal pluralism, but also practitioners, people on a day-to-day basis, trying to engage with these kind of issues, especially in Melanesia, which is where is an legal anthropologist's paradise for dealing with questions around legal pluralism. If you work in PNG, you're dealing with a country with 800 different languages, or in Melanesia more generally, 1/1000th of the world's population and yet a quarter of its languages. So each of which essentially constitutes a different legal ordering for how they understand relationships with other people, how they engage with the environment, how they engage with the state, even whether being a citizen at all is a salient aspect of their cosmology, their identity. All of these issues are just in full force in that part of the world, but you don't have to look too far around Africa and other parts of Asia to see these kinds of issues going on. And the most savvy, I think, of the development country directors, those that get out of their offices and spend time in the field and actually are in active engagement with their colleagues and counterparts, recognize that these are really serious issues that they need to get a better handle on. So I guess as a first point of, not pushback, but at least of advice to the grad students that are here working on these kinds of issues, In addition to studying every conceivable document that the World Bank has on its legal codings and all the rest of those nice things, go out to a country office and go to a big country and go to a small country. Go to a big country where we, the World Bank, need that country way more than they need us, like any of the BRICS, especially Indonesia or any of those other countries. And then go to Liberia or Sierra Leone, where the political economy relationship is entirely reversed, where they need us way more than we need them, right? And that gives you a whole different sensibility for how these things called the rules or the law plays out. Well, the unacknowledged aspect when you don't work at the World Bank is just how much discretionary power resides in the country offices. That's really where most of the action transpires. And trying to divine what the World Bank thinks or does about itself on the basis of what you can glean from websites is like trying to glean how NYU functions on the basis of its material on its website. When you're a faculty here, you know how the place functions because you have an anthropological knowledge of where the power actually resides. And so a socio-legal perspective on law is really much that everything resides in the shadow of that law. The law is there to create a negotiating space, and all the interesting stuff, all the anthropologically interesting things happen in the space where the deals are done or not. And when you're working in Melanesia or any other of these countries, you're dealing with little saplings. There is no shadow, or there's a very meager shadow created in a very nascent form of legal structuring, where the whole notion of the nation state itself is still largely a work in progress. So that's sort of the first sort of point of, not so much correction, as just emphasis if you're going to be engaging with the World Bank and its systems of decision-making. Recognize where it actually resides, and then go and study it in very different kinds of contexts, because the way those negotiations play out is very different in different places. Anyway, but what we've really learned, I think, from 10 years of doing this kind of work in these very different kinds of countries, in northern parts of Kenya, for example, where you're dealing with migrant populations who don't reside geographically in any particular area. So notions of property rights, for example, are just utterly alien to them. The notion that you own land, for example, and that the solution is that we have a better property rights or a stronger administrative code in order to be able to, that just completely bounces out. And the content of the wording, if only we got it better, it would be better. It's not these are what we call sort of ontologically orthogonal legal problems. They just reside in very different planes of existence, and they only get negotiated. The deal doesn't get done just because the wording on some particular contract is made better than other persons. So one of the key lessons that emerges from this for us is the legitimacy of the change process as being really, really central. Right? So one of the reasons that the standard law and development critiques were right, in the sense of providing a trenchant pushback against the cut and paste legal reform, was not just that it was culturally insensitive, or that it was just unable to square with the political context in which it was working. It was that the very history, the very content of how law comes to be law, how rules evolve and become law, is itself just willfully violated, it seems to me, in much of the way in which we do our law and development work. Having a much richer sense of how legal systems became legal systems, and what role, if any, then external agents can play in trying to negotiate slightly fairer and more robust political spaces wherein that contesting can occur, seems to be really central. I'll come at the end to sort of what I think more specifically the role of international actors in general is in this process. But for me, the first point that we try to make in the paper is just that the legitimacy of the change process is central, and to understand what constitutes legitimacy in that place requires a deep commitment to understanding that place, to investing the time and the effort to really understand that country on its own terms. And that's hard for lawyers to do, dare I say. Right? Well, you like being lawyers, you like staying in five-star hotels, you like feeling like a lawyer and dressing like a lawyer, and hanging out in dirty, mucky villages for months at a time in order to be able to figure out actually what's going on in these places. It's not what real lawyers do, right? So there's a big cultural norm professionally that we find with a lot of, or at least we self-select people that are willing and able to do that kind of work, because we think it's really central to understanding the shadow, understanding what's going on beyond what we can just crunch from reading a few books or downloading off the internet. The second part of it is just, I guess related to that, is just really having a much richer sense of how effective justice systems evolve, right? So reading good legal history, so to me, is just central to understand, to a good legal reformer's education. And legal reform is all the things that we most value in the history of humanity, the ending of slavery and things like that. They were certainly brought about in no small part by lawyers who knew what their game and and were very skilled at what they were doing. But they were very brave. They're enormously brave people. And so the heroes that you meet in development these days are human rights lawyers in Guatemala and these kind of places. I mean, yes, they have good technical training in what they're doing, but they're just willing to suffer in order to be able to do what they do. And I think implicitly or explicitly have a very rich understanding of just how much effort, political effort, and how much emotional effort is required to build these things that can constrain elite power, for example. So reading the Tyrannicide Brief by Jeffrey Robinson, for example, the first time ever a head of state was brought to bear under the rule of law. I mean, just unbelievable stories about very real legal reasoning and legal skills, but just people willing to suffer the most egregious forms of torture and violence for generations in order that a principle be upheld. And so, if we had a sensibility, a much richer sensibility around how these effective legal institutions came to be, the notion that we could just cut and paste our way to a better constitution in Somalia or in South Sudan would be unthinkable. And yet we still have to go through our own generational wranglings, as David Trubeck did 40 years ago. Every generation seemingly just perpetuates this same challenge, and we haven't yet learnt it. And I think part of it is because of the cultural sensibilities we have, even what it means to be a legal professional in this space. The third aspect that I think is missing is the notion of subnational legal institutions. So we can talk about international law. We can, as international actors in the World Bank, we can do deals with governments. We can notionally get things passed. We can strong-arm certain things to happen, and that we can work at that sort of level to make things happen. Or we can do our legal empowerment at the village level and get all sorts of nice stuff happening there. But the real missing middle is a lot of the subnational spaces between where citizens experience the state, or where citizens encounter each other, and at the state level where elections are held, or deals are done with international agencies or with NGOs. But there's a whole big unsexy part about looking at subnational legal structures that I think we need to somehow make more cool than they are, because at the moment we've got lots of stuff going on up here and almost nothing in the middle. And to bring it to a finance analogy, that's pretty much the same story that I think we're telling, at least that the authors of Poor Economics told us in their chapter on microfinance, is that you've got a whole bunch of stuff for microcredit banking down here, and we can do deals for the international banks up here, but small and medium-sized enterprises just are too big for these guys and too small for those guys, and so we have this big gap. And I think an analogous situation confronts us in the law as well. So those sort of things, I think, all come together to suggest that we need to think very differently about what our role as international actors in this process is, and to have a much richer analytics about why, despite the trenchant critiques that keep being offered every 10 years, if not more frequently, we still keep perpetuating in that. Part of it, I think, is just because of this cultural prejudice, as it were, that we have against actually doing the long-term, often back-breaking, morally wrenching work that it takes to actually understand legal systems on their own terms. Part of it is because the systems fundamentally don't change, right? So the reason you still get courthouses and jails built in Solomon Islands, despite the fact that every serious development practitioner would say they would be against doing that, is because under pressure, with budgets needing to be spent and very fixed and narrow time horizons, that's what we can do. And that's what we justify as a procurement-friendly, squeaky clean, by-the-books kind of approach to doing this stuff, for which we are unimpeachable by any of the rules under which we function as professionals, but which can have zero consequences in terms of changing the actual functionality of the system. So let me conclude by sort of saying, what are three things that I think that we can and should be doing more constructively as international actors, and indeed as scholars for that matter. I think on a good day at least, one of the key arguments for why the bank should be involved in a lot of these discussions is that we can exercise, on a good day, and I recognize there are many bad days, but on a good day we can exercise countervailing power. We do a lot of work in PNG and Sierra Leone, for example, where you're dealing with some of the biggest, most cashed up mining companies on the planet, trying to do deals with villagers whose only recourse against all of that is claims that they are the multi-generational owners or custodians of the land on which they live. And customary law was not set up to deal with that kind of a mismatch. These guys hire lawyers at $5,000 an hour to be able to buy off every politician in the bank in their country. There's just no way that anything like a level playing field is going on here with regards to how deals are being struck around natural resource management. So on a good day, the bank is probably the only agency in the world that has both the profile, the political clout, and the resourcing to be able to provide some non-token pushback against a playing field, as I said, that left to its own devices would be stacked like that. Maybe it's a little like that if we get involved. My days when I'm proudest to be an employee of the World Bank are those days when vice presidents and country directors and other people explicitly say that our job is to try and level this playing field of negotiating so that something a little more reasonable, a little more evidence-based will be the basis on which deliberation and decisions are made. I think we can use our convening power. So we can use our countervailing power, we can use our convening power. This was Lawrence's point this morning, I think, is that for whatever reason, other reasons that people might have, we call a meeting, people show up. We host very nice meetings, actually. And again, that can be used to gloss over and do all sorts of cynical and underhanded kind of things. But on a good day, it's the process in and through which a lot of the decisions around legal reform need to happen. We don't know. No one in this room knows how to deal with the highly inequitable, highly complicated world of negotiating transitions within traditional legal systems in the state. There is no answer. The only answer is what we negotiate. That's true in rich countries as well. It's how the Irish peace process between Catholics and Protestants was sorted out. It wasn't because there was an answer. The only answer was what you negotiated. And I think a lot of the time in what we're trying to need to work through with these issues is have the time horizons and the patience and the commitments to seeing through these long-term processes of negotiation, precisely because it's in and through that process that the content and the legitimacy of the outcomes are reached. The final sort of more prosaic point, I think, is just on questions of this, what we've talked about quite a bit already, is questions around knowledge and data. The key contribution, I think, that our team, the Justice for the Poor program, brings to the countries in which we work is that we're trying to do essentially action research work on these kind of issues. Who exactly is fighting with whom, where and when? How long have these disputes been going on for, right? Left to its own devices, that's an anecdotal debate. When a mining company comes in or a tourism company comes in and puts $20 million down and says, nice piece of paradise you got here, I'd like to buy it off you. And 20 chiefs come out of the wilderness all claiming to be the legitimate owners of this land and set off an almighty fight about who is the owner of that. There's no way in which that can be resolved on the basis of the evidence there, because there is no evidence there, right? But good anthropological long-term commitments to these kind of to that kind of research can actually begin to make this deliberation a public deliberation in the first instance, and in the second instance a deliberation that happens on the basis of a good enough basis of evidence that we can help collect. Not we as white people flying into countries and dispensing Western social science, it's us working in partnership over long-term, months and years with local counterparts who have the competence and the linguistic credibility and all the rest of it to be able to do that kind of work. So that's really, and the fourth thing, if there was one, is just the time horizon, right? No, I don't. One of the factoids that came out of our World Development Report a few years ago on fragile states was that it takes 41 years in the fastest 20 reforming countries to get a 1 standard deviation improvement in the rule of law. In the fastest 20. In the worst 20, it's forever because the trajectories are going downhill, right? So even in the most optimistic case for how the time horizons that we need to be talking about are multi-generational, probably 2 careers. Name an NGO that's got that kind of time horizon. No elected government has that kind of time horizon. And in principle, probably the bank doesn't either. But on a better day, when you look at the kind of work that some of the stuff that's being done in Indonesia right now, at least they're now starting to talk in terms of 18-year time horizons. You can't name another country that is beginning to think that way about its work program. And for these kind of tasks, these kind of legal reform tasks, which are central to everyone in this room, these are not log frameable, 3 years done and dusted, clean metrics. We know what we're doing. We can randomize our way to a squeaky clean result that's going to convince people we should be doing this. You earn the right to be able to engage in these discussions, and you have to do that, I think, when you have the best evidence that you can, when you have a convening power that makes that possible, and the time horizons that enable the back and forth, the successes and failures to work themselves out. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, Michael. Jean.
Thank you. I was told I have 5 minutes, so I'll try to be brief. And I will first start by offering some comments on Kevin's excellent paper, and then on Michael's paper. And then I'll try to draw some common threads between the two. First, starting with the World Bank sanctions paper. This is a key issue. I just want to say, and sorry if I ramble about, but I'm trying to cram in as much as possible within the 5 minutes. But we do look to the World Bank for guidance and for policy advice into anti-corruption, into procurement diagnostics, into public financial management diagnostics, and a lot of the bilateral agencies look to the World Bank for that. So this sanctions process is something key, and it relates to the fact that we need to clean up ourselves before preaching to others. To recipient countries that they need to fight corruption. So it goes with the trend of more accountability, obviously transparency, and stemming illicit flows is a key component of development finance. On a very particular issue that you raise in the paper is this tension about how can I say that? Tension between, well, the fact that anti-corruption effort may penalize the poor twice. I feel a bit of unease with that, to be quite honest. I think that that aspect, that tension between, are we missing on valuable investments if the World Bank is enforcing too strongly its sanctions regime? I don't think there's a choice, really. I mean, the fact is that corruption leads to lesser quality infrastructure. It leads to lesser quality goods and services. It is an impediment to good service delivery. And I would frankly argue the contrary. I mean, enforcing these anti-corruption efforts will lead to better investments, in my view, over the long term. It's a question of credibility, and we have to make the costs of engaging into corruption outweigh the benefits of engaging into corruption. So it's a question of credibility. And the World Bank is damned if you do and damned if you don't. The shareholders of the bank are looking to the bank to enforce this, and it's a credibility towards the developing partners, and it's a credibility ultimately towards the beneficiaries in the recipient countries. Another issue which you raise in your paper is, yes, the difficulty of evaluating the results of anti-corruption activities, and in general of evaluating governance and rule of law activities. I mean, it is very difficult. In the case of corruption, if the activities are uncovering corrupt practices, do they mean that they are working? Do they mean that they are progressing, making progress? Or it is because more light is being shone onto corrupt practices? So it's very difficult to measure, and it's very difficult to explain to a politician, as opposed to building schools or health clinics or vaccinating children. It's very difficult to explain results that come out of governance and anti-corruption activities. Let me Yeah, turning to the rule of law paper, I think it does a very good job at highlighting the need for a participatory approach and definitely local ownership in designing rule of law reforms. It's obviously the design of the reform should come from inside. Yes, there's definitely a need for focus on the political dynamics, and this is where there needs to be a participatory approach with designing rule of law and governance programs generally. And what we, bilateral donors and the World Bank also and other institutions have done, donor agencies, is to deal with government officials. But in fact, and so we've dealt with government officials in designing these programs, we're working with the supply side of accountability. And if there's no demand for accountability, well, the supply side cannot stand on its own. There won't be any kind of motivation for governments to supply accountability, to respect the rule of law, respect human rights, etc., if there's no demand for civil society for accountability. So there has to be this equilibrium in working with the government who is supplying the accountability on one hand, and with civil society on the other, and also with Parliament, and also with institutions of accountability, such as national audit offices, etc., etc. So participatory approach is key. I'm not a lawyer, but I have, again, I'm a bit uneasy when I read that it's a difficulty of defining the rule of law. I thought that rule of law was based on universally recognized principles of respect for human rights. I don't know, just an observation. The issue of results here comes again in David's paper. Again, I mean, the most concrete results are those that come from the least transformative activities. And I was thinking about this morning, and I went on the net and I remember reading this paper by Andrew Natsios, which is called The Clash of Counter-Bureaucracy in Development. And if I'm not mistaken, he's a former administrator of USAID. And that basically what he says is that the development programs that are the most precisely and easily measured are the least transformational. And that those programs that are most transformational, such as improving good governance, fighting corruption, are the least measurable. And so, you know, that's the common link between the two papers. How do you evaluate the success of the reforms for better rule of law? How do you evaluate the success of reforms geared towards combating corruption? It's a key question. It's difficult to answer. And it's honestly, it's a question and it's an issue that bilateral agencies have avoided to deal with. Because honestly, providing good governance in a recipient country, supporting good governance in a recipient country is not as sexy to politicians and to taxpayers. So at the expense of longer-term transformational results, there is this emphasis on short-term concrete results, which are not necessarily the best kind of results. I'll keep it there so that we can have time for questions. But no, these were very interesting papers, and I was very happy to have the opportunity to provide comments. Thank you.
Good. Many thanks. So, two of the things that John just mentioned, as well as several others moving in this discussion, are ones that we'll be picking up tomorrow afternoon in the more informal roundtable style workshop, to which every person here is most welcome, on interinstitutional interactions, the kind of technologies, the effects of them. And I should mention that for those interested in that, we're just about to put the actual program for that on the website. It's informal, it's meant to be in flux, but we'll have quite a few very short presentations, less than 5 minutes each. It's an interaction of ideas. And anyway, you can get the hard copy of it as a single-page document up there. So anyone who wants to pick it up and know what's going to happen tomorrow, 2 o'clock until 5:40, up here. Their program is already there, and there's also the program there for something we're doing on Wednesday morning with Philip Dunn and his group, the 4 PhD students presenting, to which everyone who wants to come is also most welcome if you're still here. But in particular, on Tuesday afternoon, we'll have 2 people talking about the local demand for accountability, the counterpart of the supply side, which through the organizational form, which is used by the Global Fund and used by the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, of requiring there to be a local counterpart organization with a similar kind of structure on the ground if you're going to become eligible to participate in the global version of that. So that's Patricia Ferreira, who did a doctorate in Toronto with Michael Drubelko and Mariana Prado, who are here, both here. She'll be talking about the EITI in that respect, and Elspeth Foman-Hans, one of our students, talking about the global funds. I just mentioned that side of it. And then we will also be talking a lot about metrics and evaluation and some of the challenges of which the points we've just made in the interaction here. This is a project which the Institute for International Law and Justice has had on indicators. We published a book on that last year. Kevin Davis and Angelina Fisher and me and a whole bunch of others, including many in this room, wrote chapters in it. And we're now moving towards another project on big data, the use of big data, etc. So that's one of our themes, and we'll be picking that up tomorrow afternoon. So with those points, we'd invite, I think, a few general comments from anybody who wants to make some. We've got several experts on exactly these 2 paper topics in the room, so them too, but everybody else. And then maybe after a little bit of that, the 2 speakers can reply briefly. Yes, please.
Sorry, thank you. Katharina Püster from Columbia Law School. I just wanted to start with a brief comment on Kevin's paper and reinforce what Jean was, I think, saying, namely that there's sort of a kind of endogenous process about what institutions have to do if they get themselves into certain types of activities. So if you start to engage in governance work, which probably you have to if you want to be really serious about institutional development, then you can't ignore the governance of your own activities and your interactions with others. So in a way, I think your question, is it good or bad, is an important one, but I would sort of say this is maybe secondary to first recognizing that probably you cannot avoid thinking about how to govern corruption that directly implicates the institutions that get themselves into governance work in the first place, both because of the shareholders and the legitimacy issues that arise in that regard, but also I think just by the nature of the game. I also want to make a comment on Michael's paper and presentation here. I would fully underwrite everything that you say. I am a lawyer, and I think many of us actually, especially in the context of transition economies in the 1990s, have argued endlessly that what it's all about is contextualization and understanding of the background of these institutions and the legal systems and their history and da-da-da-da-da. I don't want to sort of push the blame over to economists or others, but what I would like to suggest is that there are certain, also again, structures that make it very, very hard to do the kind of contextualization that you apparently do, and I would be curious to hear how you get this back, and how get this back on track, because what the World Bank has been after, in my experience, is the scalability of anything that you do, and that is counterproductive to the kind of activities that you really require the in-depth studies that you are suggesting. So there's a certain bureaucratic logic that is happening there, and then of course on top of that we have also developed all these theories, rational choice and da-da-da-da-da. If we just understand the incentive structures right, then we can also scale up and transpose to different contexts. So I very much appreciate this kind of pushback, but I'm wondering in what kind of institutional and organizational context this could be more productively done.
Many thanks, Catherine. Devesh Kapoor.
Just 2 comments, one for Kevin and one for Michael. One of the things that's always been a fairly remarkable part of the bank has been the process of ICB, or International Competitive Bidding, for its projects, which often would raise the price, but was usually relatively clean. And many developing country bureaucrats liked that part because it kept the politicians slightly at bay. In the 90s onwards, one of the things that, as many other requirements began to grow, and the transaction costs of borrowing from the bank, you got a sort of phenomenon with sort of Hosea Berlin had sort of said, all good things don't go together. And so you have this crowding out of some good goals by other good goals. And when an institution has many good goals, some of them are going to crowd out other good goals. And what has happened is that now countries borrow less for infrastructure from the bank. They do the deals with others where you don't have the scrutiny. So you actually have got more corruption in infrastructure overall, even though you have much less corruption in the bank's own projects. So just an observation. And Michael, the point about context which was raised by your and the comment, could you put your remarks in the context of the growth of contemporary social science, where context actually is not prized, where what matters is generalizable, right? And I don't think so one can understand what's happened in the bank because the bank recruits principally from American academic institutions where a certain type of social science is practiced and privileged, which does not value context. And I wonder if you want to try and put your thinking in that context.
Any other comments? Yes, James, introduce yourself, please.
James Caddy from Loyola. So interesting presentations. For Kevin, a suggestion, maybe not additional work for you, but it struck me that another innovation in management of development assistance is the pooling of monies by donors in individual countries where they hire accounting firms to manage the funds, which actually exercise a veto power over government spending as well as over entities that have been involved in corruption. And in Kenya in particular, the tension that emerged there was between, on the one hand, the accounting firm that was the financial agent for the donor funds, and the government bureaucrats who basically argued that an accounting firm had no business being in a meeting in which government appropriations were being debated. So it might seem that that's another venue in which there's been a similar type of innovation. I don't know if anybody has ever sort of looked at the role of these accounting firms. In some countries, unnamed in Africa, I understand that they actually run their budgets in some of these huge accounting firms because they have the capability to do that, which many governments do not have. I'm not sure that's an innovation or something else, but nonetheless, quite interesting. And for the other presentation, I think I was struck by the discussants' comments, which also have struck me in the course of our discussions today, between what might be measurable, or, I mean, I think he put it, the tension being between short-term measurable results versus long-term transformational projects. And I think that part of the point that I wanted to raise was, as I think Benedict already said in the morning, that what's really missing in this conversation is the agency of the people in these countries. I've been to the Solomon Islands, and the Solomon Islands is not Kenya. I mean, I was there sort of doing some work on trade, and they have absolutely no capacity. And they're this huge, you know, all these tourists coming to buy out the land there. I mean, so I'm not sure that what you might say about that, or even northern Kenya, which you address in your paper, tells us anything about what's happening in Kenya, for example, with you know, an independent judiciary that is largely homegrown. So I guess where the cases you choose might lead you inevitably to some types of results, and I think they raise the erasure of the agency of some of the local innovations that have been critical to some of the successes we see, in my view, might be the way forward, and not so much the presence of the World Bank or some other donors within these countries.
So I'll just interpose on that for Rani. Magai Akech, who did his doctorate here and teaches at the University of Nairobi, has a very nice paper on the role of KPMG as the organising agency for procurement and disbursement and the justice sector reforms in Kenya, being accountable back to the donors in Paris or London very fully, but very little accountable to aspects of Kenyan civil society. And that's at least one version of what seems to be a much wider issue to address. And the kind of, I think this conference is going to throw up lots of good papers for students or prospective people who have time to do serious work, and this seems to be very much one of them still. Yes, Rani.
I just wanted to build on something Jean had said, that there seems to be inherent tension for multilateral development banks, with their very reason for being to reduce poverty and to lend to the poorest. And sorry to keep on bringing up the example of India, but it's the one I know best. But very often in countries where you have the pockets of highest poverty, you also have severe governance issues. And so I recently did a background study for the World Bank's work in Uttar Pradesh, a state in northern India, where there are severe governance issues, but it's also one of the poorer states. And there's pressure from within the bank to, in fact, lend to this very state and others because they're the poorest. So there's an inherent tension there with, you have severe governance issues, and yet that's the bank's job to lend to these areas.
So perhaps could I invite the two speakers to reply, probably be fairly brief, because we've lurched into the sovereign debt time, but not into sovereign debt. So Michael first.
Thanks for those questions and comments. They were very helpful and instructive. As I said, I work in the research department, which is about 100 people, 99 of whom are economists and 1 of whom isn't, and you're looking at the one who isn't. And whether after 15 years, why I'm still the only one says more about them or me, I'm still trying to figure out. But having said that, that might sound like it's all a big conspiracy against social scientists or, with my colleague Vijendra Rao, we've taught a class to bank staff for 14 years now on using mixed methods in research and program evaluation. Packs out every time we teach it. We could sell off our cross-support time, so our internal consulting time many times over. It's not like we're a discriminated minority, at least as individuals, but systemically, and I guess this must be Katarina's point, is that there's still the prevailing assumption institutionally is still that pretty much economists know what there is to know, and that all this stuff is kind of color, as one of my more pejorative critiques once said. Sort of just, the real work is done by the architects and the engineers, and you guys just sort of add a bit of color around the edge of it. But that said, in terms of the effectiveness, we've started this off 10 years ago with pretty much nothing. Now we're 20 million a year, 50 staff in 12 countries. That sounds impressive at one level, and there's a rounding error in others. But it happens because country teams want us to be there, and we serve at their pleasure. A vice president could kick us out of existence anytime he or she wanted to. But we've survived different regimes coming and going in each of these countries in which we work, because at the end of the day, the country teams that we're working with really value what we're doing. And so being useful and usable to the people that are actually the users of all of this stuff is our defense, but it's also our strategy. It's sort of how we've tried to make all this work. And on the scalability question, one of my colleagues once put it nicely, we want to try and leverage at scale rather than operate at scale. I personally, and I don't think anyone on our team sort of aspires to be running some $200 million legal reform project as such. And in case you don't know, the legal department of the World Bank is it's an administrative unit of the bank. It's not a lending part of the bank. So any of the lawyers that get involved in law and development stuff do so by default, rather than because they've actually run a whole bunch of law and development projects. We, the bank, only as a result of some rule changes over the last year or so, are now even able to engage informally in some of these discussions. But what we do try to aspire to, though, is leveraging at scale. And so when the government of Indonesia, for example, invites us to be part of a team that they themselves have put together, trying to reconfigure rule systems at the local government level, or trying to figure out their legal rules around inclusivity and all that stuff. That's when we feel like we're having a big impact, not because we're now running some big mega project, but because we've changed what's thinkable, sayable, and doable, or at least part of that process by which what is thinkable, sayable, and doable by a government itself is starting to happen. And for us, at least, that's sort of the one way we've been able to keep the money flowing, keep our jobs, but also we think, more importantly, actually can provide a distinctive and positive contribution to the ongoing policy debates in these countries. Thanks.
I'll use maybe one of my minutes to actually comment on Michael's presentation as someone who likes dressing like a lawyer, at least sometimes. It seemed to me that your ideal world would be that the World Bank would hand money to country directors and then give them the discretion to do with it as they please, at least the more experienced ones, to take into account the particularities of the local situation and what it takes to achieve change. And so I'm sure that's a caricature of what you're saying, but I just want to run with that idea for the purposes of the conference, because this was presented as a challenge not to social scientific research methods, at least the dominant methods of social science research, and also to sort of bank policy, bank internal policy and the way it's structured and so forth. But it is also a bit of a challenge to the idea of law, and that's the way you presented it initially, which I found quite intriguing, the idea that the practices in this field should be governed by generalized rules that are announced in advance and are relatively inflexible. And so I think that's something that we should all reflect on, whether it is actually appropriate to have as much law as we see in the whole field of development finance. So that was my first comment. As for the comments on my paper, I guess I'll just reemphasize that the point here was to highlight the potential tensions, to point out that not everyone will take it on faith that anti-corruption work is necessarily, that the benefits of anti-corruption work necessarily outweigh the costs. Some people may have intuitions that go in the other direction, but also some will think it's an empirical question. And that's where I wanted to leave it. I didn't want to come down on one side of the issue or the other. It's really, the point was really a methodological one to suggest that in the face of that kind of indeterminacy, it's going to be difficult to come up with objective evaluations.
Well, thanks very much. I think that was a very rich panel in a very short time, covering some important ground in a stimulating way. So could I invite the people who are taking part in the sovereign debt panel to lurch up this way in order to be visible to the enthralled masses.